I am my mother's lawyer. The words, spoken in a voice that was clear, steady, and shockingly young, did not just break the formal silence of the family courtroom, they shattered it. The sound echoed off the high, wood-paneled walls like a clap of thunder on a clear day. Judge Harrison, a man whose 63 years had seasoned him with a weary patience for the endless parade of human folly, stopped his perfunctory shuffling of legal documents. He looked up, his gaze peering over the top of his reading glasses, a frown of pure, unadulterated disbelief creasing his forehead. David Thompson was only 9 years old. He was a small, skinny boy, his serious face framed by a pair of slightly too large glasses that seemed to perpetually slide down his nose. He stood on a worn wooden bench next to his mother, Janet, a position that barely allowed him to see over the top of the massive defense table. Janet looked down at her son, her own face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, a fierce, surging pride that made her heart swell, and a raw, primal terror that turned her blood to ice. Across the room, in the plush, expensive chair reserved for the petitioner, Robert Wellington III, a man whose presence filled any room with an aura of wealth and power, almost choked on his morning coffee. A small, dark stain appeared on the pristine white cuff of his bespoke shirt. "I'm sorry, young man," the judge said, his voice a carefully calibrated instrument of forced patience, "but this is a legal hearing, a proceeding between adults." He gestured vaguely with a hand laden with a heavy gold ring, encompassing the somber, intimidating space. The grim-faced lawyers in their dark suits, the stenographer with her silent, waiting machine. "This is a place for grown-ups to discuss grown-up matters." "I know that, Your Honor," David replied, his voice unwavering. He adjusted his glasses with a small, precise movement of his index finger. "I also know that according to Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was ratified by the United States in 1995, I have the right to express my opinion freely in all matters that directly affect me." He opened a worn, scribbled-on school notebook that he had placed on the table before him. "In this case," he added, his gaze sweeping the room before landing, with an unnerving intensity, "on the judge, definitely affects me." The silence that followed was no longer just a formal, procedural silence. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. It was a thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable silence, in which the established, predictable order of the world seemed to have been, momentarily, and completely, upended. Robert Wellington, the Chicago real estate mogul, a man whose personal fortune was estimated to be in the hundreds of millions, a man who was accustomed to buying, selling, and controlling every aspect of his world, turned to look at his two high-priced, and now completely flustered, lawyers. He gave them a look of such pure, venomous fury that it seemed as if he wanted to strangle them both, right there, in the middle of the courtroom. No one had prepared him for this. No one had briefed him on the possibility of having to face not just his former, and largely insignificant, mistress, but also his own, an apparently very precocious, 9-year-old son, a son who was quoting international law. Janet Thompson, David's mother, worked 60, sometimes 70, hours a week. As a nursing assistant at a local hospital, she was a woman of quiet strength, of profound, and often weary, resilience. She had raised David entirely on her own, in a small, cramped apartment in a neighborhood that men like Robert Wellington usually only saw from the tinted windows of their luxury cars. In the 8 years since a paternity test had legally, and irrefutably, confirmed that Robert Wellington was David's biological father, the man had appeared in his son's life exactly 4 times. Always with expensive, ostentatious gifts, and always with empty, hollow promises of a future that never seemed to arrive. And now, suddenly, inexplicably, he wanted full and sole custody. "Your Honor," Robert's lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Dr. Mitchell, interjected, his voice a smooth, calming purr, a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a small, nervous gesture. "This is, as you have noted, highly irregular. The child, while clearly articulate, has no legal capacity to represent himself, or his mother, in this court." "I'm not trying to represent my mother," Sir David interrupted, his voice cutting through the lawyer's smooth, condescending tone with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. "I'm here to represent myself, and if you, and my biological father, truly cared about my well-being as you have claimed in your legal filings, then you would want to hear what I have to say, rather than trying to silence me." Robert Wellington leaned over to whisper something urgent, and clearly furious, into Dr. Mitchell's ear. But David was not finished. He opened his notebook again, his movements precise, deliberate, as if he were a seasoned litigator presenting his case. "Your Honor," he said, his voice now a clear and very public declaration, "I have prepared a documented and evidence-based presentation on why I should remain in the sole custody of my mother, including," he added, pausing for a moment, his dark, intelligent eyes meeting his father's for the very first time, a look of such profound and unnerving intensity that it made the older man flinch, evidence of the petitioner's true and underlying motives for filing this lawsuit. Motives that I believe this court will find very enlightening. Robert Wellington's face, which had been a healthy, confident pink just a few moments before, now seemed to pale visibly. What, in God's name, had this boy, this child he had barely acknowledged for 9 years, discovered, and how in the world had a 9-year-old child managed to prepare, more thoroughly, more intelligently, more dangerously, for this hearing than he and his team of millionaire lawyers had? There, in that silent, and now completely captivated, courtroom, every single person present, from the judge on his high bench to the bored-looking bailiff by the door, was witnessing something extraordinary. They were witnessing a small, quiet, and deeply underestimated boy, a boy who held secrets that were capable of bringing down empires that were built on a foundation of lies. Dr. Mitchell, a man who earned over $1,000 an hour for his ability to remain calm and collected in the face of chaos, quickly regained his professional composure. He offered the judge a small, apologetic, and deeply condescending smile. "Your Honor," he said, his voice once again a smooth, reasonable purr, "while we all admire the child's creativity and his passion, this court, as we all know, deals with complex, and often difficult, issues of family law, issues that require an adequate and a professional legal representation. Then, why didn't you provide one for him?" David asked, his question a simple, logical, and utterly devastating counterpunch. He closed his notebook with a sharp, definitive snap, a sound that echoed in the silent, tense room like a gunshot. "In the last 8 months, since this case began, not a single person, not you, not my biological father, not even the court-appointed guardian ad litem, thought it was important to hear the opinion of the one person who was most affected by this decision." Robert Wellington shifted uneasily in his expensive leather-bolstered chair. There was something about the boy's calmness, his preternatural and deeply unnerving self-possession, that bothered him deeply. David didn't seem the least bit intimidated by the formal and intimidating surroundings, not by the judges' black robes, not by the expensive suits of the lawyers, and certainly not by the imposing, and now very angry, presence of his own, and very powerful, biological father. Janet watched her son, her heart a wild frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, a mixture of a profound and almost painful pride, and a deep and equally painful panic. For weeks, for months, David had been coming home from school with strange and very thick books from the public library, legal codes, children's rights manuals, volumes of court precedents. He had thought, in her naivete, that it was just another one of his academic curiosities, another subject that his brilliant and insatiable mind had decided to explore. She had never, not in her wildest and most anxious dreams, imagined that he was preparing for this, for a war. "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice a smooth and very practiced recitation of his prepared remarks, "my client, Mr. Robert Wellington, is seeking custody of his son because he is genuinely and deeply concerned about the boy's welfare. Ms. Thompson, while clearly a well-meaning and hard-working mother, simply does not have the financial or the social resources to provide the kind of educational and cultural opportunities that a clearly gifted child like David deserves." "Interesting," David muttered, as he opened his notebook again, his small childish handwriting a stark and almost comical contrast to the deadly seriousness of his words. "Genuine concern." He flipped through a few of his scribbled pages. "Your Honor," he said, his voice now full of a new and very dangerous confidence, "may I be permitted to share some facts with the court about this genuine concern?" Judge Harrison, who had presided over hundreds, if not thousands, of bitter and often ugly custody cases in his long and distinguished career, had never, ever, seen a situation quite like this one. On the one hand, he had strict and very rigid legal protocols to follow. A child could not, under any circumstances, act as his own legal counsel. On the other hand, this particular child was displaying a level of articulation, of preparation, and of pure, unadulterated, and frankly terrifying intelligence that surpassed that of many of the adult lawyers who had stood before him. David, Janet said softly, her hand on her son's small and very tense shoulder. Maybe we should just let the lawyers. What lawyers, Mom? David interrupted her, his voice gentle but firm. We can't afford to hire a lawyer like Dr. Mitchell, or any of his colleagues. We both know that. So, either I speak for us, or no one speaks for us. It's that simple. Robert Wellington, his face now a deep and very unhealthy shade of red, finally found his voice. David, he said, his voice a strained and very unconvincing attempt at a paternal and loving tone. Son, I know this whole situation is very confusing for you, but don't call me son, David said. The words came out with a coldness, a finality, that made several of the adults in the room, including the judge himself, shiver. In the last 9 years of my life, you have shown up exactly 4 times. 2 of those times were for my birthday. Both times, you were 3 weeks late. One time was on Christmas Day, a few years ago, when you had, as you put it, 20 minutes free between your social engagements. And the last time, he added, his voice now a low and very precise whisper, was when the local newspaper was doing a story on philanthropic entrepreneurs, and you needed a photograph with a suitably underprivileged-looking child. The silence that followed that last, devastating, and very specific remark was deafening. Robert Wellington opened his mouth to protest, to deny, but David was not finished. The last time we saw each other, 6 months ago, David continued, his voice a relentless and very methodical recitation of the facts. You spent a total of 15 minutes in our apartment, just long enough to criticize our furniture, to complain about the smell of medicine that my mother brings home on her uniform from the hospital, and to suggest that I might have some potential, if only I were to receive a proper and civilized education. He paused and adjusted his glasses again. Interestingly enough, he added, his voice now a quiet and very dangerous whisper, just 2 weeks after that visit, you filed for sole custody. Dr. Mitchell whispered something urgent and very clearly panicked to his client, but the boy, the small and now very formidable boy, was not finished. Your Honor, he said, his voice now ringing with a new and very powerful authority. I have done some research on my biological father. I have discovered that he has recently lost a very expensive and very public lawsuit against his former business partners. I have discovered that his third and current wife has recently filed for a very contested and very expensive divorce, and, he added, his voice now a low and very precise whisper, I have discovered something very, very interesting about a certain trust fund. A trust fund that was established by my late and very wealthy paternal grandmother. Robert Wellington's face went from a blotchy, angry pink to a stark and very terrified white, in a matter of a few short and very devastating seconds. How on earth had this boy, this child he had dismissed as an inconvenient and largely irrelevant biological accident, uncovered information that not even all of his high-priced and very discreet lawyers knew about? David turned a page in his notebook, and he smiled, for the very first time since he had entered the courtroom that morning. And it was not the innocent and charming smile of a 9-year-old child. It was the cold, hard, and very calculated smile of a person who was holding all of the winning cards, and who was now, finally, ready to play them. But before we talk about inheritances, and financial motives, and desperation, David said, as he closed his notebook again, a final, theatrical, and deeply unsettling gesture. How about we discuss why a man who has never, not once, shown any genuine, or even passing, interest in being a father, has suddenly, and so miraculously, developed such a strong, and so very convenient, paternal instinct. Robert Wellington was now visibly sweating, his expensive, and very absorbent, silk shirt clinging unpleasantly to his skin, and his team of high-priced, and now completely useless, lawyers looked utterly, and completely, lost. None of them had prepared for this. None of them had prepared to face a small, quiet, and deeply brilliant child. A child who, apparently, knew more about their own client's precarious, and very secret, financial situation than they did. What, exactly, had this 9-year-old boy discovered during his long and very quiet afternoons at the public library? And how in the world had a small and seemingly powerless child managed to gather the kind of information that adults, with their unlimited resources, their private investigators, their powerful connections, did not have. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his judicial curiosity and his professional admiration now clearly and completely piqued. In his 30 years on the bench, he had never, ever, seen such an articulate, such a prepared, and such a formidable child in his courtroom. "David," he said, his voice now stripped of its earlier condescending patience, replaced by a new and very genuine tone of respect, "you mentioned evidence. What kind of evidence could a 9-year-old boy possibly have gathered?" David adjusted his glasses again, a small, and now very familiar, gesture that was becoming his trademark in that courtroom, a small, and very powerful, symbol of his calm, and very methodical, intelligence. "Your Honor," he said, "for the past 3 months, ever since I first learned of this lawsuit, I have devoted every Tuesday and every Thursday afternoon, after school, to conducting research, at the Central Public Library." "Researching what, exactly?" Dr. Mitchell interrupted, his voice now a mixture of a deep, and very professional, condescension, and a new, and very real, note of fear. "Public records," David replied calmly. "Newspaper archives, freely available corporate documents, and of course, all of Mr. Wellington's previous, and very numerous, court cases." He opened a new, and very thick, section of his notebook. "The head librarian, a Ms. Rodriguez, who has a master's degree in information science, was kind enough to teach me how to access, and to navigate, the basic, and publicly available, legal databases." Janet looked at her son, her heart a mixture of a profound, and almost painful, pride, and a new, and very real, sense of awe. For months, David had told her that he was studying for a special project at the library. She had never, not in her wildest, and most hopeful, dreams, imagined that the project was this, that the project was them, but the project was saving his own, and very small, family. Robert Wellington finally, and completely, exploded. "This is ridiculous," he roared, his voice a raw, and very undignified, sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "A 9-year-old boy, digging into my private life, like some kind of private investigator." "It's all public information, Sir," David corrected him calmly, his voice a quiet, and very precise, counterpoint to his father's loud, and very chaotic rage. "All of it, perfectly legal, and perfectly accessible to any American citizen, regardless of their age." Ms. Rodriguez, the librarian, had, in fact, become much more than just a librarian to David, when he had first shown up in her quiet, and very orderly domain, asking her intelligent, and very specific, questions about how family courts work. She had quickly realized that this was not a case of simple, academic curiosity. This was a case of a quiet, and very profound, desperation, masquerading as a fierce, and very inspiring determination. "But boy," she had told Janet, when she had finally, and with a great deal of concern, called her the week before, "has been coming here, religiously, for 3 months. He reads legal codes like other kids read comic books. He's learning too fast to be normal. He's preparing for a war." David continued his presentation, his voice a calm, and very methodical, recitation of the facts he had so painstakingly uncovered. "I have discovered," he said, "that in the last 18 months, Mr. Wellington has faced 3 very significant, and very expensive, lawsuits. He lost a $2.3 million dispute with his former partners in Wellington Industries. His current wife, his third, has filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, which, I have learned, is often legal code for, he hid all of his money from me." Robert's face was now a deep, and very unhealthy, shade of purple. "How dare you," he hissed. "And more interestingly," David interrupted, as he methodically, and very calmly, turned the pages of his notebook, "I have discovered that my late paternal grandmother, a Mrs. Eleanor Wellington, established a trust fund of $1.7 million, specifically, and only, for me, a trust fund that is accessible only when I turn 18, or," he added, his voice now a quiet, and very devastating, whisper, "when my biological father obtains full, and sole, legal custody of me." The silence in the room was now absolute. It was a silence that was filled with the sound of a powerful, and very arrogant, man's world, completely, and irrevocably, falling apart. Dr. Mitchell was whispering something urgent, and very clearly, panicked, to his client, but Robert Wellington was no longer listening. Your Honor. This is no coincidence, David continued, his voice now ringing with a new and very powerful sense of a righteous and very hard-won indignation. My grandmother died when I was only 2 years old. For 7 long years, Mr. Wellington never mentioned my existence to her. He never took me to meet her. He never allowed her to even know that she had a grandson. Janet remembered it perfectly. She remembered the cold and very cruel words that Robert had spoken to her all those years ago. My family does not need to know about it, referring to his own and very beautiful son as if he were an object, a problem, an inconvenience. But when Mrs. Eleanor Wellington discovered my existence through a private investigation of her own son, I discovered in the estate records she immediately and very secretly set up the fund with one very specific and very important condition. David paused, a dramatic and very effective pause, knowing that every single person in that room was hanging on his every word. The money from the trust would be released for my care and for my education only if my father demonstrated a genuine and verifiable commitment to the child's welfare by obtaining legal custody. If he never sought custody, the money would go directly to me, and only to me, on my 18th birthday, with no parental access whatsoever. The math, as David had so brilliantly and so brutally laid it out, was simple, and it was cruel. Robert Wellington had ignored his son for 9 long years, and in doing so, he had missed his chance to access the inheritance money through a natural and uncontested custody arrangement. Now, broke, desperate, and facing a series of catastrophic financial and personal crises, he was trying to force a late and very unnatural custody arrangement in order to get his hands on the funds. But there's something my grandmother couldn't have possibly foreseen, David said, as he closed his notebook. She didn't know that her son would one day develop a very successful and very lucrative career in ruining small and very vulnerable family businesses through a series of predatory and highly illegal practices. Dr. Mitchell stood up abruptly, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated, professional panic. Your Honor, he boomed, his voice a desperate and very transparent attempt to stop the bleeding. This is getting completely and utterly out of hand. The child is now making wild and completely baseless accusations. I can prove everything I'm saying, David said, his voice quiet but firm. He reached into his small and very worn school backpack, and he pulled out a surprisingly thick and very organized manila folder. I have here, he said, as he opened the folder, copies of 17 different lawsuits, all from the past 5 years, where Wellington Industries has purchased properties from financially distressed and often minority-owned families for prices that are well below their market value, using insider information that was obtained through Mr. Wellington's very close and very personal contacts at several local banks. Janet watched her son, her heart a mixture of a profound and almost painful pride and a new and very real sense of awe. He was turning a simple and very personal custody hearing into an impromptu and very public criminal investigation, using only the resources of a public library and his own and very brilliant, relentless determination. One of these families, David continued, as he pulled a series of printed and very sad photographs from the folder, owned a small and very beloved local bakery, the Santos family. They were Mexican immigrants. They worked 18 hours a day. Mr. Wellington found out, through his friend at the bank, that they were 3 months behind on their small business loan, due to the emergency hospitalization of their youngest son. Robert Wellington was now visibly sweating, his face a pale and very unhealthy shade of gray. This has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with it, David interrupted, his voice now ringing with a new and very powerful moral authority, because it shows a pattern of behavior. It shows the character of a man who preys on vulnerable families for his own and very selfish financial gain. And now, he added, his voice dropping to a low and very devastating whisper, he is trying to prey on his own and very vulnerable family for the exact same reason. Judge Harrison leafed through the documents that David had so calmly and so methodically presented. His own and very experienced judicial expression was growing increasingly and very visibly serious. Where did you get all of this information, David? He asked, his voice now full of a new and very genuine respect. Public court records, Your Honor, David replied, as he meticulously and very calmly listed each and every one of his sources. local newspaper archives, corporate incorporation documents, which are available on the state's public database. All of it. He paused, and a small, and very grateful, smile touched his lips. Ms. Rodriguez, my librarian, she taught me that the truth is almost always publicly available. We just have to know where, and how, to look for it. Dr. Mitchell, in a last, desperate, and very pathetic, push, tried to regain some semblance of control. Your Honor, he said, his voice now a weak, and very unconvincing shadow of its former, and very confident self. Even if these allegations were to be true, which, I must stress, we are not, at this time, admitting, they do not change the fundamental fact that my client, Mr. Wellington, can provide a far superior level of educational and financial opportunities for the child. And David smiled. It was not the innocent and charming smile of a 9-year-old child. It was the cold, hard, and very calculated smile of a grandmaster in chess, who had just saved his most powerful and most devastating card for the very end. About education, he said, as he opened a final, and very thin, section of his notebook. May I be permitted to share something interesting with the court about Mr. Wellington's true, and very specific, educational plans for me? And it was then, in that moment, that Robert Wellington finally, and truly, understood what he had so foolishly, so arrogantly, and so fatally underestimated. His 9-year-old son was not just smart, he was strategic, and he had somehow uncovered secrets that even his own, and very expensive lawyers didn't know. What, exactly, had David discovered about Robert's true, and very secret, plans for his education, and how in the world, had a small, and seemingly powerless, child managed to build a stronger, and more devastating case than a team of millionaire lawyers, using only the resources of a public library? Very brilliant help of a dedicated, and very kind, librarian. In the silent, and now completely, and utterly, captivated courtroom, every single person present waited, with a bated, and very anxious, breath, for the final, and very devastating, revelation. A revelation that promised to be even more shocking, and even more damning, than anything they had heard so far. On the subject of education, David repeated, his voice a calm, and very precise, instrument in the silent, and now supercharged, courtroom. He opened a final thin section of his notebook with the meticulous, and deeply unsettling, precision of a surgeon. I would like to share Mr. Wellington's true, and very specific, educational plans for me. Robert Wellington swallowed hard, a dry, painful, and very audible sound. His eyes, which were now wide with a new, and very real, terror, darted nervously between his lawyer, who was now just as pale as he was, and the small, and now very formidable boy who had, in the space of a few short minutes, become his worst, and most terrifying nightmare during one of my 4, and very brief visits from him, over the past 9 years. David continued, his voice a calm, and very methodical, recitation of the facts. I happened to overhear a very interesting, and very revealing, phone conversation. Mr. Wellington was talking to someone, I do not know who, about how he was going to, and I quote, solve the child problem, after he had obtained legal custody of me. Dr. Mitchell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly, and very jarringly, on the polished, wooden floor. Your Honor, he boomed, his voice a desperate, and very transparent, attempt to stop the bleeding. Private conversations cannot. I can prove every single word, David interrupted, his own voice quiet, but firm. He reached into his small and very worn school backpack, and he pulled out a small and very sophisticated digital recorder. Ms. Rodriguez, my librarian, she also taught me that documenting your evidence is a fundamental and very important part of any successful legal case. The silence that followed that last, and very devastating, statement was absolute. It was a silence that was filled with the sound of a powerful, and very arrogant, man's world completely, and irrevocably, and very publicly, falling apart. Robert Wellington was now visibly shaking, his fingers drumming a frantic, and very uncontrolled, rhythm on the surface of the mahogany table. He now realized, with a sickening, and very final clarity, completely, and utterly, underestimated his own son's intelligence, his own son's brilliance, his own son's capacity for a quiet, and very deadly strategic revenge. This recording, David explained calmly, as he placed the small and very powerful device on the table before the judge, was made during his last visit to our apartment. Just 6 months ago, Mr. Wellington thought I was in my room, doing my homework, but I had left my recorder, which I use for my school projects, in the living room. Accidentally, of course. Judge Harrison picked up the small, and very sophisticated, device, and he examined it. "David," he said, his own voice now, a low and very serious rumble, "are you absolutely certain you want to present this as evidence in this court?" "Absolutely certain, Your Honor," David replied, his own voice a quiet and very firm whisper. The judge nodded to the court clerk, who took the device and pressed the play button. The sound of the recording, sharp and clear and very, very damning, echoed through the silent, and now completely and utterly captivated courtroom. The unmistakable and very arrogant voice of Robert Wellington filled the room. "Listen," he was saying, his voice a low and very confidential purr. "As soon as I get legal custody, the boy is going straight to the Riverside Military Academy. It's a strict, no-nonsense boarding school, way out in the middle of Colorado. They know how to handle troubled children. He'll stay there, out of sight and out of mind, until he's 18. And I," he had added, his voice now full of a new and very triumphant glee, "will have full and complete access to all of the inheritance funds, for his educational expenses, of course." The other person's voice on the recording was inaudible, a faint and very distant murmur, but Robert's voice was crystal clear. "Exactly," he had continued. "The tuition is only about $500 a month for a place like that. A bargain. The rest of the money is all mine. The kid doesn't even have to know that the money ever existed. It's a perfect and very elegant solution. She," he had added, his voice now a dismissive and very cruel sneer, "is out of the picture. I have access to the funds, and I still get to look like a responsible and very caring father." Janet covered her mouth with her hands, a choked and very painful sob escaping her lips. The tears, which she had been holding back for so long, now streamed freely and very silently down her face. She had never, not in her wildest and most cynical dreams, imagined that Robert could be so cruel, so calculating, that he had planned to get rid of their son, their beautiful and very brilliant son, so completely and so callously. Dr. Mitchell was now as pale as a ghost, his own and very expensive legal career now flashing before his very eyes. He realized, with a sickening and very final certainty, that his client had just been completely and utterly and very publicly destroyed by his own and very arrogant words. "There's more," David said calmly, as he signaled to the clerk to stop the recording. "This next part is about what he really and truly thinks of me." The second part of the recording was, if possible, even more devastating and even more damning than the first. "The problem isn't just the money," Robert's voice had continued, his tone now a low and very confidential grumble. "It's the boy himself. He's too smart for his own good. He asks questions. He observes everything. It would be for the best, for everyone, to keep him out of the picture until he's 18, and I can get the whole financial situation sorted out. Kids like him, well, you know, we don't want him getting any ideas above his station." Robert Wellington finally and completely exploded. "This is a trap," he roared, his voice a raw and very undignified sound of pure, unadulterated, and very cornered panic. "He provoked me, on purpose. A 9-year-old boy can't, a 9-year-old can't." "What?" David interrupted him, his own voice now cutting through his father's loud and very chaotic rage like a sharp and very cold knife. "Can't be smart, can't defend himself, can't expose the truth about a father who sees his own son as a problem to be solved." Judge Harrison turned off the tape recorder, and he looked directly at Robert Wellington, his own eyes now a mask of cold and very judicial fury. "Mr. Wellington," he said, his voice a low and very dangerous rumble, "this recording, when combined with the extensive financial evidence that has been presented here today, paints a very clear and very ugly picture of your true, very criminal motivations. Your Honor," David continued, his own voice now a calm and very methodical counterpoint to his father's loud and very chaotic rage, "I have also discovered that the Riverside Military Academy has a terrible and very well-documented track record. In the last 5 years, 3 different students have committed suicide there, and the institution is currently under a federal investigation for the physical and the emotional abuse of its minor students." Dr. Mitchell, in a last desperate, and very pathetic, Hail Mary, tried one last time to regain some semblance of control. "Your Honor," he said, his own voice now a weak, and very unconvincing, shadow of its former, and very confident, self, even considering these allegations. "The fundamental fact remains that my client, Mr. Wellington, has far superior financial resources to do what?" David interrupted him, his own voice now ringing with a new, and very powerful, moral authority. "To send me to a place where children die. To use my own inheritance money to pay for it, while he pretends to care about me. To isolate me from the only person in this entire world who has ever truly and unconditionally loved me." Robert Wellington finally and completely lost his composure. "You're nothing but an arrogant and very ungrateful child," he roared, his face now a deep and very unhealthy shade of purple. "A child who doesn't know his place. I am your father," he screamed. "You are a stranger," David replied, his own voice a quiet and very devastating whisper. A whisper that seemed to suck all of the air out of the room. "Who happens to share my DNA? A real father wouldn't try to get rid of his own son just to steal his money." The judge banged his gavel, the sharp and very final sound echoing through the nascent and completely and utterly captivated courtroom. "Mr. Wellington, you will sit down, and you will be silent," he commanded, his own voice now a low and very dangerous rumble, "or you will be removed from my courtroom immediately." David turned to the last and very final page of his notebook. "Your Honor," he said, "there is one last thing that I need to mention. Something that I discovered about why my grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Wellington, really and truly set up that trust fund in the first place." Robert Wellington paled even more, if that was even possible. "I found a letter," David continued, "from her in the estate files. A letter that was addressed to me, to be opened on my 16th birthday." He took a deep and very steadying breath. "But my librarian, Ms. Rodriguez, she helped me to find out that I can, in fact, request an early and a legal access to it, in cases of a significant and a very contested custody dispute." The final and most devastating bombshell was about to drop. "My grandmother," David said, his own voice now thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel until this very moment, "wrote that she knew. She knew that her son, Robert, had never been a good man, and would never be a good father. She wrote that she had established the trust specifically to protect me from him. And she wrote," he added, his own voice now a quiet and very powerful whisper, "that if he ever tried to get custody of me, just for the money, that I should use every single and very considerable resource in that trust to defend myself against him." David closed his notebook, and he looked directly at Robert Wellington, his own eyes now full of a quiet and very sad pity. "She even hired her own private investigators," he said, his voice a quiet and very final whisper. "Investigators who documented all of his financial schemes, all of his lies, all of his betrayals over the years. It's all on file." With the fund's administrator, Robert Wellington slumped in his chair, a broken and very defeated man. He finally, and truly, and very painfully, understood that he had been completely and utterly and very brilliantly outmaneuvered by his own and very dead mother, and by his own and very much alive and very, very formidable son, a son he had considered to be nothing more than an inconvenient and very annoying obstacle. Judge Harrison banged his gavel again, the sound now a sharp and very final note of a righteous and very hard one, justice. "Based on all of the extensive and very damning evidence that has been presented here today," he declared, his own voice now ringing with a new and very powerful moral authority, including the financial documents, the audio recordings, and the plaintiff's own and very demonstrated history of a predatory and a very criminal behavior, "the custody request is, hereby, and with extreme prejudice, categorically and completely denied." He paused, and his own gaze, which was now as cold and as hard as steel, settled on Robert Wellington. "Furthermore," he added, his own voice now a low and very dangerous rumble, "I am ordering a full and a very immediate investigation into the possible fraudulent and a very criminal use of any and all of the trust funds that are associated with the Wellington estate." Dr. Mitchell was whispering something urgent and very clearly panicked to his client, but it was obvious to every single person in that room that the case was irretrievably, and very spectacularly, lost. David methodically, and very calmly, put away all of his materials, displaying the same quiet, and very profound, self-possession he had maintained throughout the entire, and very grueling hearing. "Your Honor," he said, his own voice now a quiet, and very respectful, whisper, "may I be permitted to make one last, and very final, request?" "You may, David," the judge replied, his own voice now full of a new, and very genuine, admiration. "I would like Mr. Wellington to know," David said, as he looked, not at his father but at the judge, "that I did not do any of this out of anger, or out of a desire for revenge. I did it because every single child in this world deserves to have a family that truly, and unconditionally, loves them, not one that sees them as a financial, and a very convenient, opportunity." As Robert Wellington was being escorted out of the room by two very large, and very serious-looking security guards, the judge had, in fact, ordered his immediate, and very public, arrest for attempted fraud. David finally, and for the very first time, allowed a small, and very tired, smile to appear on his face. In that silent, and now completely, and utterly, transformed, courtroom, a 9-year-old child had just proven, to himself, and to the entire world, that intelligence, and preparation, and a true, and very powerful, love can, and will, always, in the end, defeat any amount of money, of power, of privilege. But David's victory, he now knew, represented something much, much greater than a simple, and very personal, custody battle. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change his own, and very small, family's life, and the lives of countless other families forever. 3 years have passed since that historic, and now legendary, day in court, and David Thompson's life has been transformed in ways that even his own, and very precocious, intelligence could not possibly have predicted. The recording, the one that had so completely, and so publicly, destroyed Robert Wellington, had not only won the case, it had, as these things often do in the modern, and very interconnected, world, gone viral. The story of the 9-year-old lawyer had turned David into a national symbol, a symbol of a new generation of children who were refusing, with a quiet and very powerful dignity, to accept injustice silently. The video of his calm, and very brilliant, courtroom performance had racked up over 50 million views, and it had inspired new, and very significant, legislative changes, which were now known as David's Law, in 17 different U.S. states. Today, on our show, the host of America's Morning, the country's most watched, and most influential, morning television show, announced her own face wreathed in a bright, and very admiring, smile. "We are so honored to welcome 12-year-old David Thompson, the young man who, 3 years ago, shocked the entire country by successfully defending his own mother in court, using only his own, and very brilliant wits and the resources of a public library." The studio audience burst into a warm, and very emotional, round of applause. "David," the host continued, her own voice now full of a new, and very genuine, admiration, "how does it feel to be called the smartest kid in America?" David, who was now taller, and who was wearing a new, and very stylish, pair of glasses, but who was still as calm, and as self-possessed as ever, smiled a small, and very humble, smile. "I'd rather just be called David," he said, his own voice now a little deeper, but still as clear, and as firm, as ever. David, who learned that every single child in this world has a voice, even when the adults around them are pretending not to listen. The studio audience burst into another, and even more emotional, round of applause. Janet, David's mother, watched from the backstage green room, her own eyes now full of a new, and very bright, pride. She was wearing her new, and very crisp, nursing supervisor's uniform, a promotion she had received after her own, and very moving, story had inspired a national campaign about the struggles, and the triumphs, of working single mothers. The hospital where she worked had even set up a new, and very generous, scholarship fund, which they had named the Janet Thompson Program, a fund that was specifically designed to help the children of their own, and often very low-income, employees. And his mother, Janet, is here with us today, as well, the host continued, her own voice now full of a new, and very genuine, warmth. "Janet, how does it feel to see your son become an inspiration to millions, and millions, of families, all across the country?" Janet joined them on the stage, still a little shy, and a little overwhelmed, by all of the attention, but her own face now radiating the same quiet, and very powerful pride she had felt on that fateful and very terrifying day in court. David has always been special, she said, her own voice now a little stronger, a little more confident than it had been 3 years ago. But what makes me the most proud is not his intelligence, it's his heart. He could have used his story to brag, to show off, but instead, he chose to use it to help other families, other children, and it was true. David had, in fact, spent the last 3 years of his young, and now very public, life visiting schools in underserved, and often overlooked, communities, teaching other children about their own, and very basic, legal rights. His book, a simple, and very powerful, guide to the legal system for children, which he had titled, Every Child Has a Voice, had become a national bestseller, with all of the proceeds going to a new, and very successful, non-profit fund, a fund that provided free and very effective legal assistance to low-income families who were involved in difficult, and often very painful, custody disputes. David, the host asked, her own eyes now shining with a new, and very genuine, admiration. Tell me about the cool law library project that you started. While David explained, as he adjusted his glasses, a small, and now very familiar, gesture that had become his trademark, after I saw how a simple, and very public library had literally saved my own life, and my mother's life, I thought. How many other kids are out there, going through similar, and very difficult situations, without knowing where to turn for help, without knowing that they, too, have rights? He paused, and a small, and very determined, smile touched his lips. So, we created small, and very accessible, sections in over 1,200 public libraries, all across the country. Sections that are filled with books about children's rights, written in a simple, and very easy to understand, language, as well as computers, that have free, and very easy, access to all of the basic, and very important, legal resources. The camera focused on Janet, who was discreetly, and very proudly, wiping away a tear. In 3 short, and very transformative years, she had watched her son turn a moment of profound, and very personal, trauma into a national, and very powerful, social movement. Meanwhile, across town, in a small, and very shabby, studio apartment in the rundown, and very forgotten, suburbs of Chicago, Robert Wellington was watching the same, and very popular television program. His hair was now mostly gray, his clothes were simple, and a little worn, and he worked as a salesman, at a large, and very impersonal, electronics store, the only job he had been able to find after his own, and very public, story had become national news. The court-ordered, and very thorough, investigation into his finances had revealed not only his attempt to defraud his own son's trust fund, but a vast, and very complex, web of other financial, and very criminal, schemes. And it had completely, and utterly, destroyed Wellington Industries. Robert had lost everything: his company, his mansion, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom. He had spent 18 long, and very humbling, months in a federal prison. The kids on the show again, he muttered to himself, his own voice now a bitter and very resentful grumble, as he turned off the television in a fit of pure, and very impotent anger. In 3 long and very painful years, not a single week had gone by without David's story, his own story, appearing somewhere, in some form, a constant, and very public, reminder of his own, and very spectacular crimes. The most painful, and most humbling thing of all for Robert, was that David, his own very brilliant son, never ever spoke ill of him in public. When he was asked about his biological father, the boy always responded with a quiet, and very profound, maturity, a maturity that only served to further embarrass the man who had so callously, and so cruelly, tried to use him. I hope he finds peace, David had said, in a recent, and very widely publicized, interview. And I hope he learns that true love, and true family, cannot be bought, or stolen. Holding a grudge doesn't help anyone, but setting boundaries is essential to protecting the people that we love. Back in the television studio, the host was asking her final, and very important, question. David, she said, what advice would you give to the other children out there who are facing their own, and very difficult, family situations? David thought for a long, and very silent, moment, and then he looked directly into the camera, his own, and very young eyes, now full of a quiet, and very profound, wisdom. First he said, his own voice now a little deeper, but still as clear and as firm as ever, you are not alone. Second, you have more power than you know. And third, he added, his own voice now a quiet and very powerful whisper, the truth always finds a way to win, even when it seems impossible. He paused, and when he continued, his own and very young voice carried the weight and the wisdom of a person who had faced giants and had won. Don't let anyone ever convince you that you are too small to make a difference. I was 9 years old when I changed my own life and my mother's life forever. You can change yours, too. 6 months later, David received a special and very important letter. It was from a 10-year-old girl from Los Angeles named Sophia Martinez. She had used the Cool Law Library project to help her own and very immigrant grandmother avoid an unjust and very illegal eviction. The letter ended with a simple and very powerful sentence. Thank you, she had written, for teaching me that every single child has a voice. I used mine, and I saved my family. Janet found David in his room, reading the letter, surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of similar and very moving letters from other children from all across the country. How does it feel? She asked him, her own voice now a quiet and very emotional whisper, to know that your own and very personal courage has inspired so many other people. David carefully and very lovingly folded Sophia's letter, and he placed it in a special and very treasured box, where he kept all of his other and very precious correspondence. Remember when you told me, he said, his own voice now, a quiet and very thoughtful murmur, that sometimes the scariest things in life turn out to be the most important. Janet nodded, remembering that conversation, that moment, perfectly. I think I understand now, he said. If Robert Wellington had never tried to tear us apart, I would never have discovered that a single and very determined child can, in fact, change the world, especially when the adults around them have stopped underestimating them. That same day, David received a phone call that would change his life, again. It was from Harvard University. They were offering him a full and very prestigious scholarship to a new and very special program in law and in social justice. It was the first and only program of its kind in the entire country, and it had been created specifically for students who had demonstrated an exceptional and a very real social leadership before the age of 16. Will you accept? Janet had asked him, after he had hung up the phone, her own heart a mixture of a profound and almost painful pride, and a new and very real sense of awe. I accept, David had said, a small and very determined smile touching his lips. But on one condition. I want to use my education, he had said, his own voice now ringing with a new and very powerful sense of purpose, to create a legal system that protects all children, not just the ones who are lucky enough and smart enough to be able to protect themselves. Years later, when David Thompson became the youngest lawyer to ever be admitted to the bar, at the age of 16, his very first case was a class-action lawsuit against the national educational system for failing to teach the basic and very fundamental rights of children in the country's public schools. He won, and he set a new and very powerful precedent, a precedent that made a basic and very important legal education a mandatory part of the curriculum for all American students. Robert Wellington never fully recovered from his downfall. He lived a modest and very quiet life, working a series of menial and very humbling jobs that barely paid his bills. He sometimes found himself thinking about the extraordinary and very brilliant son he had so carelessly and so cruelly lost to his own and very insatiable greed, and in his rare and very painful moments of honesty with himself, he recognized that David had become exactly the kind of man that he himself had never, not once, been able to be. David Thompson's story had proven that true and lasting strength does not come from money, or from power, or from connections. It comes from a combination of intelligence, of courage, and of a deep and very unconditional love. A 9-year-old boy had defeated a corrupt and very powerful system, using only the resources of a public library, his own and very unwavering determination, and the profound and very transformative power of the truth. David had learned that when you fight for what is right, the universe, in its own and very mysterious way, conspires in your favor. And Robert Wellington had learned that underestimating a determined and very brilliant child can be the most expensive and most devastating mistake of a lifetime. And millions of children all around the world had learned that their voices matter, that their rights are real, and that they are never, ever too small to fight for justice. David's greatest and most profound revenge was not in destroying Robert Wellington. It was in building a legacy that would save thousands, if not millions, of other families from the same and very painful injustices that he and his mother had so bravely and so brilliantly faced.